"My heart is ice," Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ravensmore, had said. Not in anger, not in grief, in the flat, certain tone of a man stating a fact about the weather. He had said it to his solicitor the morning he signed the guardianship papers. He had said it to his mother's old physician when the man suggested, gently, that the two little girls now sleeping in the East Wing needed more than structure. He had even said it to the mirror, that cold, candlelit mirror in the master dressing room of Ravensmore Hall, and the mirror had not argued with him. That was 14 months ago. Tonight, on a frost-hardened evening in February of 1847, Edmund stood at the edge of his own stable yard and watched a woman he had scarcely spoken to in 6 months throw herself between his nieces and 1,200 pounds of panicking horse. She did not scream. She did not run. She did not look back to see if anyone was watching. Clara Voss, governess, hired through an agency, quiet as furniture, present at every meal and noticed at none, spread her arms wide, planted her boots in the frozen mud, and walked forward. One step, then another, straight toward the animal as it reared and shook its head and sent stable boys scattering in every direction. She spoke to it. Edmund could not hear the words from where he stood. He could only see the line of her, slight, straight, entirely without armor, and the way the horse slowed, then stilled, as though something in her voice had reached a place that terror could not. Lily and Rose, 5 and 3 years old, the only living remnants of his brother William, stood pressed against the stable wall with their small hands clasped together. They were not crying anymore. They were watching her. So was Edmund. He pressed one fist against his chest without thinking about it, as if something had shifted there, as if a wall had developed without warning a crack. He told himself it was the cold. He was wrong. Ravensmore Hall had not always been cold. There had been a time. Edmund remembered it the way one remembers a summer visited only in childhood, when the house had sound in it. His mother was at the piano in the evenings. His younger brother William laughed too loudly in the corridors, always in trouble, always forgiven. Fires lit not merely for warmth, but for company. That was before the debts, before the title, before the long, grinding years of Edmund learning to be what a duke must be, composed, decisive, and entirely self-sufficient. His father had raised him on 2 principles: that emotion was a luxury the powerful could not afford, and that the Ashford name meant something, which meant Edmund must mean something too. He had honored both principles faithfully. He was 34 years old and had not been in love, had not wept in company, and had not once asked anyone for help. Then William died. The carriage had overturned on the Bath Road on a Tuesday in March. William and his wife Helena both gone. Instantly, the coachman said, without suffering. Edmund had stood in the solicitor's office 3 days later and signed papers with the same steady hand he used to sign parliamentary amendments. He had felt the grief, certainly. He was not without feeling. But grief was a private matter, and Ravensmore was a large house with many rooms that were locked. The children were a different problem. Lily was 4 years old when she came to Ravensmore. Rose was 2. They arrived with a nurse who left after 3 weeks. Too isolated, she said, too far from London, and a trunk full of small dresses that made Edmund deeply uneasy every time the housemaids carried it past him. He had arranged for a new nurse, then a temporary governess, then the permanent engagement of Miss Clara Voss, procured through an agency in London and delivered to his door in August with a letter of reference that described her as capable, patient, and discreet. He had interviewed her in the library. 10 minutes. She had answered every question without embellishment. She asked 2 questions of her own, about the children's current routine, and whether the schoolroom had adequate light. She did not ask about her own accommodations, her half-days, or the social standing of the household. She seemed, Edmund had thought, entirely indifferent to impressing him. He had found it mildly irritating and wholly acceptable. "The position is yours, Miss Voss," he had said, already looking back at the letter in his hand. "Thank you, Your Grace," she had replied, and left the room so quietly he had not even heard the door. For 6 months, that was the entirety of their relationship. She managed the children. He managed the estate. They occupied the same house the way 2 ships might occupy the same ocean, aware of each other's existence, charting separate courses, never in danger of collision. He noticed her only in the margins of his day. The distant sound of Lily's laughter from the schoolroom when she thought no one could hear. Rose's small voice reciting her letters in careful repetition. Clara read aloud to them after supper. He had passed the half-open door once, and paused, one hand on the frame, listening without meaning to. She was telling them a story she seemed to be making up as she went, something about a fox and a frozen river and a very stubborn swan. The children were entirely enchanted. Edmund had walked on without making a sound. He had told himself he noticed none of it. He was, in this as in much else, not entirely honest with himself. The evening that changed everything began without significance. Edmund had returned from a meeting with his land agent, later than expected, the February dusk already settling over Ravensmoor's grounds as he dismounted at the stable. He handed his horse off and turned toward the house, and that was when he heard it. The crack of wood, the shriek of metal, and then the high, thin scream of a horse in panic. One of the stable hands had improperly latched the paddock gate. The young bay gelding, already skittish in the cold, had shouldered it open and was loose in the yard, ears flat, hooves striking sparks on the frozen stone. In the middle of that yard, directly in the animal's path, stood Lily and Rose. They had come out without permission. Some errand of childhood imagination. Edmund would learn later they had been following a cat. They stood frozen now, too frightened even to run, Rose clutching the back of Lily's dress. And Clara Voss was already moving. She had come out of the side door on a run. But she did not keep running. She slowed. She stopped. She put herself between the children and the horse, spread both arms to make herself as wide as possible, and stood. The gelding shied at her, snorted, pawed the ground. She took one step toward it. Every instinct Edmund had trained over 34 years told him to shout, to act, to take command of the situation. He could not move. Not because he was afraid, because he could not look away. She spoke to the horse in a voice so low and steady it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than language. She did not flinch when it struck the ground within a foot of her boot. She kept moving, slow, steady, relentless, until her hand was on its neck, until the animal's trembling began to ease, until the yard was quiet again except for the sound of the wind and the distant calling of the stable hands. Then she looked back at the children. "Come," she said. Her voice was entirely calm. "Let us go in. You must be frozen." Lily ran to her. Rose ran to her. Both of them pressed against her sides as she turned them toward the house, one small hand in each of hers, and walked them inside without looking back. Edmund stood in the stable yard for a full minute after they were gone. He pressed his fist against his chest again. That same strange pressure. He told himself it was nothing. He went inside. He did not sleep well. He told himself he would not address it. What was there to say, after all? The governess had done her job. The children were unharmed. The horse had been restabled. The matter was concluded. And yet the next morning, when Edmund passed the schoolroom on his way to the library, he stopped. The door was open. Clara was seated at the table with the girls, and she was teaching Lily to draw. Not copying letters, not reciting geography, drawing. The kind of lesson that would appear on no curriculum Edmund had approved. She had paper spread across the table and a small tin of charcoal pencils, and she was guiding Lily's hand with complete seriousness, as though this were as important as any academic subject. Rose, too young to manage the pencils, was arranging dried flowers in a row along the windowsill and narrating their qualities to no one in particular. Edmund stood in the corridor and watched. He could see the side of Clara's face. There was nothing remarkable in it, no particular beauty, no striking feature. She was perhaps 7 or 8 and 20, with the quiet self-possession of someone who had learned early that the world did not reward drawing attention to oneself. Her hands, guiding Lily's, were steady and sure. Lily said something Edmund could not hear, and Clara smiled. Not a governess's professional smile. A real one, the kind that changed the whole face, that reached the eyes, that arrived without calculation. Edmund moved away from the door before she could turn and see him. He went to the library. He sat at his desk. He stared at the correspondence in front of him for 20 minutes and read not a single word of it. He summoned her that afternoon. He did not know precisely why. He told himself it was to address the incident, to ensure the children had not been frightened, to perhaps review the safety protocols for outdoor excursions. Clara arrived in the library with the same composure she brought to everything. She stood before his desk with her hands folded and waited for him to speak. "I witnessed the incident in the stable yard last evening," Edmund said. "Yes, Your Grace. You placed yourself in considerable danger." "The children were in greater danger," she replied. It seemed the logical response. Edmund looked at her. She met his gaze without apparent difficulty, which he had noticed before and continued to find mildly unnerving. Most people looked away from him within a few seconds. She did not. "It was reckless," he said. "Perhaps. I am not praising you, Miss Voss. I did not assume you were, Your Grace." A silence fell. Edmund was aware that it was he who had created the awkwardness, and that Clara seemed entirely undisturbed by it. "The children were not harmed," he said at last. "No. They were frightened. But Lily is resilient and Rose follows her sister's lead. They slept well." A brief pause. "I made certain of it." Edmund's jaw tightened slightly. Not in irritation, or not only in irritation. In something else. Something he did not have a ready name for. "Were you afraid?" he asked. It was not a question he had intended to ask. It arrived before he could intercept it. Clara seemed briefly surprised, the first fracture in her composure he had ever seen. She considered the question with what appeared to be genuine reflection. "Afterward," she said. "Not during. There is only what must be done." She paused again, and something in her expression shifted. Smaller, more guarded. "I imagine Your Grace understands that feeling." He did. With sudden and uncomfortable clarity, he did. "That will be all, Miss Voss," he said, looking back at his desk. "Your Grace." She turned to go. "Miss Voss." She stopped. Edmund did not look up. He was not entirely sure what he had intended to say. What came out was, "The children are fortunate that you are here." A silence. Then, "They are easy to love, Your Grace. I think perhaps they have simply not been told that often enough." She left. Edmund set down his pen and looked at the closed door for a long time. He did not know whether she had meant the last sentence as a statement about the children alone. He was afraid she had not. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There were no great declarations, no grand events. What happened instead was subtler, and in its own way more dangerous. Edmund began to notice things. He noticed that Clara read to the girls every evening, and that she chose the books not from the approved shelf of instructive texts, but from his own library, borrowing volumes she must have hoped he would not miss. He noticed this because one morning he reached for his copy of Persuasion and found it gone, and discovered it a week later, returned so precisely to its original position that he nearly missed the slight difference in the angle of the spine. He said nothing. He noticed that she took the children outside every day, regardless of the weather, because she had apparently decided that fresh air was non-negotiable. He began, without intending to track her by the sound of Lily's laugh from the garden, which carried further than Clara perhaps realized, up past the library window on still mornings. He noticed that she ate alone in the schoolroom, and that she never once appeared in a communal room of the house uninvited, that she occupied the least space possible, that she moved through Ravensmoor like someone who had learned the art of becoming invisible, and who had perhaps learned it young, and not by choice. That thought, when it arrived, unsettled him more than the others. One morning, a Sunday, when the children were at lessons in the village church, Edmund came down to the library earlier than usual and found Clara there. She had not heard him. She stood at the far window with a book open in one hand and a cup of tea going cold in the other, entirely absorbed. The winter light came in gray and clean across the room, and she had her back to him, and for a moment Edmund simply stood in the doorway and watched her breathe. Then she turned a page, and the movement of her hand recalled him to himself, and he stepped fully into the room. She heard him then. She startled, genuinely startled, and the book nearly fell. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I did not realize." The children are at church and I thought, I will leave at once. You may stay, Edmund said. The words came out before he examined them. Clara looked at him. You are not disturbing anything, he added, moving toward his desk with what he hoped was the air of a man who had not just surprised himself. She did not leave. She returned carefully to her position by the window. Edmund sat at his desk. For 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the most disquieting thing about it. What are you reading? He asked at last. She turned the cover toward him briefly. Middlemarch. I hope you do not object. I should have asked permission. I told you before, Miss Voss, that you are free to borrow from the library. He paused. He had, in fact, told her no such thing. That had been in the letter from the agency, which he had barely read. That is, the arrangement was understood. Yes, Your Grace. Her mouth curved slightly. She knew perfectly well he had just improvised that, and she was kind enough not to say so. Edmund looked back at his correspondence. Eliot is a better moralist than most ministers, he said, to the letter in his hand. I find her understanding of loneliness to be particularly precise, Clara said quietly to the window. Another silence, different from the first. Edmund cleared his throat and began to read. March came in hard, carrying with it the particular bleakness of late winter refusing to surrender. Frost on the ground in the mornings, brief bright afternoons that gave way too quickly to long gray evenings. The house felt it. Even fires in every room could not entirely banish the cold that seemed to live in Ravensmoor's stone walls. Edmund noticed, one evening, that the library fire had been rebuilt. He had let it burn low. He often did when absorbed in work, the cold being something he endured without complaint. But when he looked up from his ledgers at 8 o'clock, the fire was blazing cleanly, and there was a fresh cup of tea on the corner of his desk. He had not rung for it. He asked his butler the following morning. Halsworth cleared his throat in the particular way he had when navigating an awkward fact. It was Miss Voss, Your Grace. She passed the library door on her way upstairs with the children and observed that the fire had been allowed to go down considerably. She asked me to have it rebuilt and took the liberty of bringing tea herself rather than waiting for the kitchen. A pause. She mentioned that cold rooms are wasteful, Your Grace. She seemed to feel strongly about it. Edmund said nothing. He dismissed Halsworth. He sat for a moment. Then, despite everything, the corner of his mouth moved. He pressed it flat immediately, but it had moved. He did not thank her. He did not know how to thank someone for a fire without making it into a larger thing than it was. But the following week, when he passed the schoolroom and saw that the children's coal bucket was nearly empty and did not ring for a footman but went and had it refilled himself, he was aware that he was, in some awkward and inarticulate way, responding in kind. Clara never mentioned it either. But he saw her expression as he passed the schoolroom doorway. Briefly, just briefly, and it was not surprising. It was something more careful than surprising. Something that looked, if he had been willing to name it, like gratitude being held very tightly in check. The situation with Lady Pendleton arrived in mid-March and shattered the quiet. Lady Agatha Pendleton, Edmund's mother's closest friend, and a woman who had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of the Ashford family's reputation since before Edmund could walk, arrived at Ravensmoor without announcement on a Thursday, was shown to the drawing-room, and proceeded to deliver what she clearly considered a long-overdue correction. Edmund endured the first 10 minutes with his customary composure. Lady Pendleton had opinions about the girl's education, too rural, too isolated, too far from the improving influences of proper society. She had opinions about their appearance. She had passed them in the hallway, and they were perfectly dressed but rather too sunburned for young ladies. She had opinions about their diet, their schedule, their prospects. Then she said, "And the governess? Where does she come from? She has the manners of a tradesman's daughter, Edmund." The girl answered me in the hallway with barely a curtsy. I was not impressed. Something tightened in Edmund's chest. "Miss Voss's manners," he said, in the quiet, precise tone that his parliamentary opponents had learned to fear, "are exactly as they should be." Lady Pendleton blinked. "Edmund. She is employed to educate and care for my nieces," he continued. She does so with a dedication and intelligence that I have seldom encountered in any person in any capacity. Her courtesy to a passing visitor is not a subject that warrants my attention. A silence. Lady Pendleton studied him with sharp, knowing eyes. She had known him since he was 8 years old, and she had never, in his recollection, been successfully silenced. "I see," she said at last, in a tone that contained a great deal more than 2 words usually held. "The children are healthy and well-taught and happy," Edmund said. "That is the only standard by which the governess's performance concerns me." Lady Pendleton took a sip of tea. "Happy?" she repeated thoughtfully, as if tasting the word for its implications. "You have noticed they are happy. I am not blind, Agatha." "No," she said, "you are not, though you have occasionally chosen to act as though you were." She set down her cup. "I shall say only this. The last time I saw genuine feeling in your face was when your brother was alive. I was beginning to wonder if you remembered how." She left after an hour, and Edmund stood at the library window long after the sound of her carriage had faded. He was thinking about what she had said. He was thinking also, with an unease he could not entirely justify, that Clara had been somewhere in the house during that conversation, that the walls of Ravensmoor were old and not always thick, that he did not know what she might have heard, and that for the first time in a very long while he cared. He found her that evening in the corridor outside the nursery, a stack of mended dresses over one arm, a candle in her hand. She was heading to the linen cupboard. "Miss Voss." She turned. The candlelight caught her face. "Your Grace." "I wish to—" He stopped. He was not accustomed to beginning sentences he did not know how to finish. Lady Pendleton's remarks this afternoon were not a reflection of my view. Clara looked at him steadily. "I was not within hearing, Your Grace," which meant she had been, or she would not have said so. Edmund held her gaze. "Nevertheless," he said. A pause. Something moved in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but the edge of it. The place where warmth was trying to exist and had not yet been given permission. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That is kind." She continued down the corridor. Edmund watched the candlelight carry her away. He did not tell himself it was nothing this time. There was a Sunday evening in late March that Edmund would return to afterward, many times and always with the same feeling, that this was the evening the ice began to fracture, not at the edges but at the center. He had been in the drawing room after supper, reading without much concentration, when he heard it. Music. Not the careful, correct playing of a girl at practice. The kind of competent, joyless sound that accompanied most drawing-room pianofortes at Ravensmoor. Real music, played with feeling, in the room just down the hall that had been his mother's sitting room and had not been used since her death. Edmund set down his book. He walked down the corridor and stopped in the doorway. Clara was at the old piano. She had opened it herself. The key was kept in the drawing room. She must have found it. The candles were lit. The girls were not with her. They were asleep. She was entirely alone, and she played as people play only when they believe no one is listening, with the fullness of herself without performance or restraint. He did not recognize the piece. Something old, something gentle, something in a minor key that moved through the quiet room like water moves through stone. Edmund stood in the doorway and felt something so foreign to him that it took him nearly a minute to name it. Longing, not for Clara or not only for Clara, but for the thing she was doing, for the ease of her feeling, the openness of it, the fearless willingness to be moved by something and to let it show. He had spent so long building walls that he had forgotten that walls were built to protect something worth protecting. He had begun to suspect, lately, that he had protected himself right out of everything worth having. Clara reached the end of a phrase and her hands stilled. She had heard him, or sensed him. She turned, and her face in the candlelight was not composed. It was still open from the music, unguarded, and it was the most honest face Edmund had ever seen in his life. "Forgive me," she said at once. "I should not have, the key was—" "Please continue," Edmund said. She looked at him. "If you would," he added, with an effort that cost him something. "I was not aware anyone in the house still played." A moment, then Clara turned back to the piano. She played for another half-hour. Edmund did not move from the doorway. When she finished and began to close the instrument, she glanced back at him with an expression that was quiet and careful and entirely without demand. "Your mother's?" she asked, meaning the piano. "Yes." She had good taste. She straightened, picked up her candle. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Miss Voss." She passed him in the doorway, close enough that he felt the warmth of the candle flame, close enough that he was aware, with sudden and inconvenient precision, of how small the distance was between her shoulder and his arm. She was gone before he could do anything about it. He remained in the doorway of his mother's sitting room for a long time. His cousin arrived in April. Reginald Ashford, heir presumptive to the dukedom in the event of Edmund's death without legitimate issue, a fact Reginald had never fully managed to set aside, came to Ravensmoor under the pretext of a family visit and stayed for what he announced would be a fortnight. Edmund had never liked Reginald. He was 10 years younger, possessed of a handsome face and a plausible manner, and had spent most of his adult life living on the assumption that Edmund would not live long. Not from malice, Reginald was not malicious precisely, but from the particular kind of laziness that afflicts men who believe the future is already arranged in their favor. He was charming at dinner, appropriate with the children. He complimented Ravensmoor's restoration and asked sensible questions about the estate management. And from the second evening he watched Clara. Not impolitely, not in a way Edmund could immediately object to, but with a consistent, calculating interest that set Edmund's nerves on edge in a way he told himself had nothing to do with anything personal. He told himself that until he walked into the morning room and found Reginald leaning against the doorframe of the schoolroom, watching Clara teach, his arms folded, a particular smile on his face. "Remarkable woman," Reginald said, without turning, when Edmund appeared beside him. "Miss Voss is employed to teach the children," Edmund said, in a tone of perfect neutrality. "Oh, absolutely." Reginald glanced at him sidelong. "Only making an observation." He paused. "You've been remarkably attentive to the schoolroom lately, Edmund. For a man who barely acknowledged the girl's existence 6 months ago. The girls are my responsibility." "Yes, indeed." Reginald smiled. "And the governess. Also your responsibility." Edmund looked at him. The look was quiet and long and entirely sufficient. Reginald found something else to do. But the damage was beginning to be done, and it came from a direction Edmund had not anticipated. Not from Reginald's interest in Clara, but from what Reginald said at dinner 2 nights later, in front of Edmund's land agent and 2 visiting neighbors. "The girls are growing wonderfully," he said, with perfect pleasantness. "Though I can't help but wonder, shouldn't they be in London by now? Proper schooling, proper society. Lily is nearly of an age where connections matter. Keeping them out here in Yorkshire with a hired girl for company seems rather limiting." The table went quiet in the particular way it does when someone has said something that everyone knows was meant for one pair of ears. Edmund set down his wine glass. "The girls are exactly where they should be," he said. "In a home, with someone who loves them." He did not look toward the corridor. But he was aware, with complete certainty, that Clara was passing through it with the children's supper tray, that she would have heard every word. Reginald raised an eyebrow. "Love," he repeated lightly, "an interesting standard for a hired employee." "Miss Voss," Edmund said, still in that quiet, precise parliamentary voice, "has given my nieces more of herself than anyone in this house has had the decency to offer them, including this family. Including myself." He looked at Reginald directly. "I would encourage you to remember that." Another silence. The subject was not raised again. But Edmund sat with his own words for the rest of the evening, and they unsettled him. Not because they were wrong, but because they were entirely true, and he had said them in front of witnesses, and something about saying them aloud had made them heavier and more undeniable than they had been when he had only thought them. He went to the library and poured himself a glass of brandy he did not drink. He sat by the fire Clara had rebuilt, the fire he had learned without discussion to keep lit, and he thought about what he was doing, about what this was becoming, about what it meant that the prospect of Clara leaving Ravensmoor, for any reason, by any means, felt, when he examined it clearly, like a version of the cold he had been trying to drive out of this house all winter. He had spent 14 months telling himself his heart was ice. He was beginning to understand that ice, given sufficient warmth, melts. The question was whether he was going to let it. 2 days later, he found the note. It was on the floor of the corridor outside the library. A small, folded piece of paper that had slipped, presumably, from someone's pocket. Edmund picked it up without much thought and was halfway to setting it on the hall table when he recognized the handwriting on the outside as Reginald's. He did not open it. He stood there for a long moment. Then he set it on the hall table, precisely as he had intended, and walked on. He was not a man who read other people's correspondence. But when he passed the schoolroom an hour later and heard Clara's voice inside, steady and warm, telling Lily the names of the constellations, and when he heard Rose interrupt with a small, earnest question about whether the stars could see her back, he stopped. He stood in the corridor with his hand not quite against the wall and listened. And he thought, whatever Reginald intended, it would not touch this. He would make certain of it. He did not yet know how close he would come to being wrong. Clara Voss had not come to Ravensmoor easily. She had come, as most governesses come to isolated houses, because there were no better options and because the alternatives were worse. Her father had been a country clergyman. Decent, bookish, perpetually insufficient to the demands of the world. He had given her an excellent education and a deep love of music and a complete absence of dowry, which is to say he had equipped her for life in every way except the one that mattered in 1847 England. When he died, Clara was 24 years old, without relations of means, without a husband, and without any skill more marketable than her learning. She had taken the first position offered, then the second. Then, after 2 years in a London household that had taught her precisely how little protection a woman in service possessed, the posting to Yorkshire had seemed less like a consolation and more like a rescue. She had not expected to love the children. She had thought she would be professional, efficient, careful. She had thought she would teach them their letters and keep her heart out of it, because keeping her heart out of things was the discipline that had kept her intact through everything that had come before. But Lily and Rose were not the sort of children one kept one's heart out of. Lily, dark-eyed, quick, with her father's laugh and something of her mother's dangerous charm, had decided on the second day that Clara was her particular property and had proceeded to treat her accordingly. Rose, smaller and quieter, had taken longer, but when she finally reached up one afternoon and wordlessly took Clara's hand, Clara had understood that she was lost. She loved them. She had stopped pretending otherwise to herself around the 3rd month. She had not allowed herself to think about Edmund. She had tried, at least. She had observed him the way one observes something large and potentially hazardous, with attention, from a careful distance, with a clear mental catalogue of reasons why one does not get any closer. He was her employer. He was a duke. He was a man who had made a deliberate architecture of coldness and who had shown every sign of intending to maintain it indefinitely. But she had also seen him, late at night, standing in the doorway of the nursery. Just standing there. The girls long asleep, the house quiet, and Edmund with his hand on the doorframe and an expression on his face that had nothing to do with duty or architecture and everything to do with something he was not yet able to name. She had seen him rebuild the coal bucket. She had seen the way he answered Lady Pendleton. She had heard what he said at dinner about love. Clara was not a foolish woman. She was, in fact, a woman who had survived on the careful and precise management of her own expectations, and she was not about to abandon that discipline because a grieving, guarded duke had shown a few consecutive signs of being, underneath the ice, a human being. But she was also not made of stone. She knew what Reginald was. She had understood him within an hour of his arrival, not because he was overtly threatening, but because she had met the type before. A man who views women in service as existing in a convenient gray area between person and property. He was careful. He was always careful where Edmund might see. But he found excuses to be in the schoolroom corridor. He appeared at the garden door when she was outside with the girls. He said things that were perfectly polite when examined one word at a time and perfectly clear when examined whole. She managed him with the same quiet, steady competence she brought to everything. She did not engage. She did not react. She made herself, when he was present, as transparent as possible, and she counted the days until his fortnight was over. She did not tell Edmund. She would not have him think she needed saving. She would not put him in the position of having to act on her behalf, which would mean acknowledging that she was something more to him than an employee, which was a conversation neither of them was prepared to have. What she did not anticipate was the lake. It happened on a Thursday, the tail end of April. The world was finally warming, genuinely warming, and Clara had taken the girls to the edge of the estate's ornamental lake after lessons. A treat, well within the bounds of the usual afternoon walk. Rose had fallen asleep in the pram. Lily was throwing pebbles at the water's edge. Clara was sitting on the grass with a book she was not reading when she heard Reginald's step on the path behind her. She rose immediately, every nerve in her body aligned. "What a pleasant coincidence," Reginald said. He smiled. He always smiled. "Mr. Ashford." She moved slightly, putting the pram between them without making it look like that was what she was doing. "We were just returning to the house." "Surely not yet. The afternoon is beautiful." He looked at Lily, who was watching him with the frank, unimpressed assessment of a 5-year-old who had no idea what she was reading. "Lily, why don't you see how far you can throw that stone? As far as you can." Lily looked at Clara. Clara shook her head once, very slightly. Lily set down the stone and came and stood beside Clara. Reginald's smile didn't change. "You have a remarkable influence over them," he said to Clara. Something had altered in his voice. Still polite. Something underneath it no longer was. "Edmund has noticed, you know. The whole house has noticed. I wonder, have you?" "I think," Clara said, in the voice she had used with the horse, level, unhurried, with no room in it for fear, "that we should return to the house." She lifted Rose from the pram, gathered her against her shoulder, took Lily's hand. "Miss Voss." His voice hardened, fractionally. "I am only trying to have a conversation." "I know," Clara said, looking at him directly one last time. "That is precisely the difficulty." She walked back to the house. Lily trotted beside her. Rose slept on her shoulder, warm and oblivious. She did not look back. She fed the girls. She bathed them. She told them the story about the fox and the frozen river and the stubborn swan. She tucked them in and kissed their foreheads and sat in the rocking chair between their beds until she was certain both of them slept. Then she went to her own room and sat on the edge of her bed and shook very quietly for about 3 minutes, after which she straightened her spine, washed her face, and went downstairs to return the book she had borrowed from the library. Edmund was there. He was standing at the window, his back to the door. He turned when she entered, and whatever he saw in her face, she had not quite achieved the composure she'd been reaching for, made him go very still. "What has happened?" he said. "Not what is the matter. There is something wrong. What has happened?" As if he already knew something had. Clara set the book on the desk. "Nothing of consequence, Your Grace." "Clara." It was the first time he had used her name. They both heard it. Neither of them moved. "What has happened?" A silence. She told him. Not everything. Not the shaking. Not the fear that was less about Reginald than about the realization that she had nowhere to go if this position ended. No one to appeal to, no shelter at her back. She told him the facts of the afternoon, cleanly and without embellishment, and she watched his face as she spoke. She had never seen that expression on him before. She had seen him cold. She had seen him composed. She had seen the edges of something warmer. She had not seen this particular stillness that was not composure but something closer to controlled fury, the kind that lives in the jaw and the hands and nowhere that shows. "He will leave tomorrow morning," Edmund said when she finished. "Your Grace, I don't wish to cause." "He will leave tomorrow morning," Edmund said again in the same voice. "And he will not return to this house while you and the children are in it." Clara looked at him. "Thank you," she said softly. Edmund looked back at her. The fury was still there, but something else had moved through it. Something that had less to do with Reginald and more to do with the 12 inches of air between them that suddenly felt both very small and very significant. "You should have told me sooner," he said, quietly, without accusation. "I was managing." "Yes, He held her gaze. You always are. It was not a criticism. It was something far more complicated than a criticism. Clara picked up her candle from the desk. Good night, Your Grace, she said. Good night, Edmund said. And then, as she reached the door, Clara, she turned. You are, he stopped, began again. The children would not be the children they are without you. I want you to know that I am aware of that. Clara held his gaze for one long, unguarded moment. And you would not be who you are becoming, she said quietly. Without them. She left before he could answer. He stood in the library until the candle he had not lit had no reason left to be lit. Reginald left the following morning. His departure was correct and civil on the surface being the only thing Reginald ever exposed to scrutiny. He said nothing to Clara. He said nothing to Edmund either except the ordinary things. A good journey, good health to the children, best regards for the season. But as his carriage rounded the drive and disappeared between the trees, Edmund felt the house exhale. May arrived, and with it warmth, real warmth, the kind that stays. The moors turned green, the gardens came back, and Lily discovered that she could run faster than any of the stable dogs. A fact she tested repeatedly and with great satisfaction. Rose learned her first poem and recited it to Edmund one evening after supper. Standing very straight in the drawing room with her hands clasped, looking, Edmund thought, exactly like her father at 6 years old. He had to look away before she finished. He admitted to himself at some point during the second week of May, sitting in the library at night with a glass of brandy and no correspondence, which was unusual, that something had shifted permanently. That whatever he had been before Lily and Rose came to Ravensmoor, and whatever he had been before Clara, was not recoverable. Was not, if he examined it honestly, even desirable. He had built walls to protect himself. He had been protecting himself for so long that he had forgotten what it was he'd originally been protecting. He knew what he felt for Clara. He had known it, with a clarity he could no longer deflect, since the evening in his mother's sitting room when she had played and he had stood in the doorway and understood what longing was. What he did not know was what to do about it. She was in his employ. She had no family to appeal to, no social position to negotiate from, no safety net beneath her if he made an error. If he spoke and she felt compelled to respond in a way that was not her genuine feeling, simply because she could not afford to lose the position, he would never know. And that thought, the possibility that she might say yes to him for the wrong reasons, was more repugnant to him than the possibility that she might say nothing at all. So he did the thing he was best at. He waited. He was patient. He was present without pressing. He told himself that time and proximity and honesty would eventually create a space in which something real could exist. He was not wrong. He was, however, not fast enough. In the third week of May, Rose fell ill. It began as a cough, slight, unremarkable, the kind of thing that arrives in spring with the pollen and the damp evenings. Clara reported it to him on a Monday morning with appropriate calm, noting that she had already restricted Rose's outdoor time and would monitor the situation. Edmund nodded and thought little of it. By Wednesday evening, the cough had deepened. Rose's cheeks were too bright. Her eyes, when Edmund crouched beside her at supper, were glassy with the beginning of fever. He looked at Clara across the child's head. I've already sent for the physician, Clara said quietly. Dr. Hames arrived on Thursday morning, examined Rose thoroughly, and announced that it was a chest complaint. Serious, but treatable with rest, steam, and a course of medicine he would compound himself. Keep her warm, he said. Keep her still. Someone should sit with her through the nights until the fever breaks. It should not be longer than a week. He looked between Edmund and Clara. I will sit with her, Clara said. We will sit with her, Edmund said. Hames raised an eyebrow. They both ignored him. The next 4 nights were the longest Edmund could remember. He and Clara divided them. She took the earlier hours, he took the late ones, and somewhere in the middle there was an hour or two when neither of them could sleep, and so they simply sat, one on each side of Rose's small bed, and kept watch together. They spoke quietly so as not to wake her. Small things at first. Rose's favorite stories, the names Clara had invented for the cats that came to the kitchen garden. A question from Edmund about whether Lily was managing, whether she understood what was happening with her sister. But the small things gave way to larger ones in the way they do when it is late and a child is sick and the guards that daylight maintains begin to slip. On the second night, Edmund said, "My brother and I were not close in the end. I want you to know that, not because I did not love him, but because I was always too busy being responsible to remember to be present." Clara looked at him across Rose's sleeping form. "You are present now," she said. "I have been trying to be," Edmund said. He looked at Rose. "She has her father's hair," he added quietly. "I never told him how much I admired him in the end. The way he loved recklessly. I thought it was a weakness. And now I think it was the truest thing about him." A silence. "Tell me about your father," Clara said. And he did. He talked until the fire needed rebuilding, and then Clara rebuilt it, and he talked more. He told her about the estate and the weight of it, about the years of managing everything alone, about the thing his father had said to him when he was 12 years old, emotions are luxuries, and how he had taken it as instruction rather than as the flaw it was. Clara listened. She did not interrupt. She did not offer him absolution or argument. She simply listened with the full weight of her attention, and that listening felt, in ways Edmund could not have articulated to anyone who had never been listened to, truly listened to in their adult life, like being seen. "What about you?" he said at last. "You have never told me anything about your life before Ravensmoor. There is not much to tell that would recommend it. Tell me anyway." And so she did. She told him about her father's parish, about the books that had been her education and her company, about the 2 years in London that she described in plain terms that told him, between every word, considerably more than what she was saying. She told him about the cold drawing rooms and the families who had looked through her, about the gradual understanding that invisibility was both a burden and a skill. "I learned to make myself small," she said. "It kept me safe." Edmund looked at her. The firelight was on her face, and she was entirely unguarded, and he thought of her in the stable yard with her arms spread wide, entirely visible, refusing to disappear, and of how much that had cost her, how far it was from what she had learned to do, and how much it had told him, without a word, about who she really was. "You are not small," he said. "You have never been small. Not for a single moment since you came to this house." Clara looked at him. "Edmund," she said. Just his name. Nothing else. It was enough. He reached across Rose's sleeping form and took her hand. She let him. They sat like that for a long time, without speaking, while the fire burned and the wind moved against the windows and Rose breathed in her sleep, steadily, quietly recovering. On the 5th night, the fever broke. Edmund was the one sitting with her when it happened. Clara had finally agreed to sleep, after he had insisted with more firmness than he'd intended. He felt the change in Rose's temperature before he saw it. Something lifting, some held tension in the small body releasing. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead and felt coolness, true coolness, for the first time in 4 days. Rose opened her eyes. "Uncle Edmund?" she said, in a thin, wondering voice. "I am here," he said. She looked at him. Then I looked around the room. "Is Miss Clara coming?" "In the morning. She is sleeping." Rose considered this. "She sat with me for a very long time," she said, in the reasoning tone of a 3-year-old performing a complicated moral calculation. "She didn't go away." "No," Edmund said. "She didn't. Because she loves us," Rose said. "Yes," Edmund said. His voice was not entirely steady. "She does." Rose seemed satisfied. She closed her eyes again. Edmund sat in the chair beside the bed and held his niece's hand and thought about walls, and what they were built from, and what it would take to finish dismantling them. Rose recovered fully within a week. She was thinner and tired more easily than before, and she clung to Clara with a ferocity that Clara accepted without comment, carrying her on one hip about the house for several days until Rose was satisfied that she would not, in fact, be abandoned. Lily, who had been admirably patient through her sister's illness, made up for it by talking more or less constantly for the following 4 days. Edmund watched all of this from a careful distance and felt, with every passing hour, the absurdity of continuing to maintain that distance. He had held Clara's hand across his niece's sickbed. They had sat through 4 nights together and said more to each other than most people said in a year. She had called him Edmund, Just his name, just once, and it had turned his world over completely, and he had done nothing about it because he was still, despite everything, afraid. He was afraid of being wrong. Afraid of the power he held over her circumstances, which made any declaration he offered difficult to separate from compulsion. Afraid of wanting something so much that the wanting itself seemed like a reason for caution. He was still afraid on the Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after Rose's fever broke, when the letter arrived. It came from London, from the agency through which Clara had originally been placed. It was addressed to Clara, and Edmund only knew of its contents because Clara told him, which she did that same evening in the library, standing before his desk with her hands folded exactly as she had stood on the first day, except that nothing about this felt like the first day. "I have been offered a position," she said. "In London. The family is well regarded. The children are older." She paused. "The salary is considerably more than what you pay me." Edmund set down his pen. "Are you asking my permission to accept it?" he said carefully. "I am informing you," Clara said, "as is proper." He looked at her. Her face was composed. Her hands were still. She was, he thought, entirely terrified, and hiding it with the expertise of someone who had been hiding things for a long time. "And what do you want?" he asked. "Not what is proper. What do you want?" A long silence. "I want to know," Clara said at last, her voice lower, "whether I have a reason to stay." There it was. All of it. No ornament, no protection, no retreat to invisibility. Just Clara Voss standing in the last of the afternoon light and asking him, directly, the only question that mattered. Edmund stood. He came around the desk. He stopped in front of her, too close for any professional reading of the situation, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "You have every reason to stay," he said. His voice was rough at the edges, the roughness of something long contained. "You have the children who love you. You have—" He stopped. Began again. "Clara, I have spent 34 years building a life that was entirely correct and entirely empty, and I have been unable to tell you what you mean to me because I was afraid that telling you, given the situation, would be a form of compulsion I could not justify." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. "But I find," Edmund said, "that not telling you is worse, because you are standing there asking me whether you have a reason to stay, and the answer is, you are the reason this house is a home. You are the reason the children laugh. You are the reason the fires stay lit." He took a breath. "You are the reason I remembered what I had been protecting all along." Clara's composure, held so carefully for so long, broke. Not in collapse, in release. 2 tears, swift and clean, down the side of her face, that she did not attempt to hide. "Edmund," she said. "Stay," he said. "Not as a governess. Not as an employee." He reached out and took her hand. Not across a child's sickbed this time, but plainly, deliberately, in the full light of the room. "Stay as my wife if you are willing. Stay as the girl's mother. Stay because I am asking you and because I believe, I hope, that you want to." Clara looked at their joined hands, then at his face. "You are afraid of nothing," she said. "You stood in a stable yard and faced a panicking horse without any armor at all." "Not nothing," she said quietly. "I was afraid of this." She looked at him. "Of wanting something I might not be allowed to have." Edmund's grip on her hand tightened. "You are allowed," he said. "You have always been allowed." Clara closed her eyes. "I opened them." "Yes," she said. "Yes, Edmund. I will stay." He kissed her, gently, carefully, with the full weight of everything he had spent a year refusing to feel. She did not pull away. She stepped closer. And for the first time in Ravensmoor's long history of cold and silence, the library felt warm all the way to the stone. Society had opinions. This was inevitable. A duke did not marry his governess in 1847 without generating a considerable volume of opinion, and Edmund had known from the moment he spoke that the volume would be considerable. He had decided, at some point during the 4 nights of Rose's illness, holding Clara's hand in the firelight, watching her breathe, that he did not care. He did not say this in those words. He said it in the language available to dukes, which was the language of action. He visited Lady Pendleton in person, on a Tuesday, and told her directly. She received the news with a silence so long that a lesser man might have wilted. Then she said, "Well, it's about time you did something human." He wrote to Reginald formally with legal counsel attending. The letter was brief and very clear. He announced the engagement to the household staff himself, in the kitchen, without ceremony, to the assembled faces of people who had watched Clara rebuild fires and read to children and manage every form of difficulty with quiet competence for 8 months, and observed with some interest that the reaction was not shock, but something that looked, in several cases, like relief. Halsworth, the butler, cleared his throat in a complicated way. "If I may say so, Your Grace," he said, "Miss Voss is, that is to say, the entire household has long considered Miss Voss to be—" He paused. "We are very glad," he concluded. "Good," said Edmund. There was still the formal season. There was still London and the drawing rooms, and the women who had known Edmund's mother and had opinions about what constituted appropriate elevation. He took Clara to London for 3 weeks in June, and she moved through the social world with the same quiet, grounded steadiness she brought to everything, and those who looked closely enough, which, it turned out, was most of them, found nothing to work with, except Lady Harcastle, who found something. It was at a dinner party at the home of Lord and Lady Vane, at a table of 14, that Lady Harcastle, who had been studying Clara's dress, which was fine, and her manners, which were impeccable, and her hands, which showed the traces of real work, because Clara had never pretended otherwise, said, with the thin precision of a woman who never wasted ammunition, "It must be such a novelty, Miss Voss, to find oneself at a table of this kind. After so many years below stairs." The table went still. Edmund's hand, resting on the white cloth, did not move. Clara turned and looked at Lady Harcastle. She was entirely composed. She was, Edmund would remember afterward, magnificent. "I was never below stairs, Lady Harcastle," she said, in the pleasant, conversational tone of someone making a straightforward correction. "I was in the schoolroom, which is where I fell in love with the man I am to marry and with the children who will shortly be calling me mother. I find I am rather fond of it." She smiled. "I hope that is not too great a novelty for the table." A silence. Then Lord Vane laughed, the genuine laugh of a man who has witnessed something that pleased him deeply. His wife followed, and then, like a tide, the rest of the table. Lady Harcastle said nothing further. Edmund looked at Clara across the table with an expression that he made no effort to conceal. She looked back at him with her own, quiet and clear and utterly without armor. Later, in the carriage back to the townhouse, with the city lights passing across the windows, Clara sat beside him with her hand in his and said nothing for a long while. "You did not need to come to my defense," she said at last. "I noticed you were about to." "I was," he admitted. "You were faster. I have had practice managing myself." "Yes," Edmund said. "You have." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, briefly, in the dark of the carriage. "I intend, for the rest of our lives, to give you considerably less occasion to need it." Clara turned her head and looked at him. "Don't make it a project," she said softly. "Just be here." "That," Edmund said, "I can manage." 1 year later, the wedding was held at Ravensmoor, in the chapel that had stood at the edge of the grounds for 200 years and had never looked better than it did on that September morning, full of late light and the last roses from the garden, which Lily had arranged herself with tremendous seriousness and only moderate success. It was a small ceremony, entirely by choice. Edmund had been offered the cathedral, the season, the full machinery of ducal pomp. He had declined all of it with a single word. Clara had smiled when he told her. She had said, "Good." They were married by the parish vicar, who had known Edmund since childhood and cried through much of the ceremony. Lily wore a yellow dress she had selected herself and stood beside Clara with the gravity of someone performing a vital function. Rose, rather overcome by the occasion, spent most of the service pressed against Edmund's leg, which he accommodated without comment. Lady Pendleton sat in the front pew and wept unashamedly and was, when the register was signed, the first to embrace Clara, which silenced what remained of the London objections more effectively than any declaration could have done. Ravensmoor changed. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic way of stories, the curtains flung open and the cold driven out in a single triumphant gesture. It changed the way real things change. Gradually, unevenly, in ways that could only be measured by looking backward. The fires stayed lit. The schoolroom acquired more books, and a collection of rather eccentric drawings pinned to the wall, and a bowl of dried flowers that Rose replenished every week from the garden. The library acquired a second armchair drawn close to the first, and a habit of long evening conversations that ranged from the ridiculous to the genuinely important without the slightest transition. Lily learned to play the piano. Not well, yet, but with the reckless enthusiasm of someone who has been shown that music is a thing worth pursuing. The sound of her practicing carried through the old stone house, and Edmund, working at his desk in the library, would pause sometimes and simply listen. Rose asked questions. Endless, bottomless, completely unanswerable questions, which Clara answered with patience and imagination and occasional invention, and which Edmund answered with the careful honesty of someone who had decided that his niece deserved the truth even when the truth was, "I don't know." She seemed to find this deeply satisfactory. One evening in October, a year, almost to the month, since the night in the stable yard, Edmund found Clara in the garden after supper. She was standing at the far end of the rose walk, a shawl around her shoulders, looking out over the moors in the last of the evening light. He came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The horse," she said. He looked at her. "I was thinking about standing in the yard with my arms out," she said, "and how afraid I was, and how I didn't let it stop me." She was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid of other things too that winter, larger things, things I didn't have words for." "And now?" he asked. Clara turned and looked at him. The evening light was on her face, and she was entirely unguarded. Exactly as she had been that night at the piano, when he had stood in the doorway and understood what he felt, and had been too afraid to act on it. He was not afraid now. "Now I am exactly where I chose to be," she said. "And so are you." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and for a while neither of them spoke. The moors ran out to the horizon in every direction, gray and green and endlessly themselves. The house behind them had fires in every room. Somewhere inside it, two small girls were presumably asleep, or if not asleep then engaged in the sort of quiet, elaborate conspiracy that was becoming their speciality. "My heart is ice," Edmund said, quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Clara look up. He was smiling. She understood. She understood everything he meant by it, the distance, the walls, the long, cold years, and the long, slow dissolving of them. She understood what it meant that he could say it now not as a declaration but as a history, something that had been true and was no longer. "Not anymore," she said. "No," Edmund agreed. "Not anymore." The last light faded over the moors. Inside Ravensmoor Hall, the fires burned on.